May 1945. The war in Europe is over. But across the shattered landscape of Germany, silence is deceptive. Cities lie in ruins, factories are hollowed shells, and forests conceal the remnants of a once mighty army. Amid this devastation, Allied soldiers are stunned, not by tanks or artillery, but by a seemingly humble, lightweight fleet, Germany's military jeeps, the Kübelwagen and the Schwimmwagen. These were Volkswagen's answer to the American Jeep, compact, clever, and efficient. Tens of thousands of them litter the fields, forests, and factory yards, some still fully operational, others abandoned mid-assembly. For the Allies, they were everywhere. Soviet troops found over 2,000 Kübelwagens in Berlin alone, parked in neat rows in bombed-out depots. In Bavaria, American forces discovered the Wolfsburg factory, its assembly lines frozen in time, hundreds of jeeps partially built, surrounded by machines and tooling. British troops in Lower Saxony came across vast motor pools of intact vehicles, many stripped of parts by retreating Wehrmacht units. These vehicles were unarmored and unarmed, yet they sparked a rush of activity among the victorious Allies. Not for their battlefield capabilities, but for their utility, engineering ingenuity, and potential post-war use. Unlike heavy tanks, these jeeps could be driven away without transporters, making them highly portable assets. And while soldiers at first admired their simplicity and reliability, the Allies quickly faced a dilemma. What should be done with them? The Kübelwagen was light, just 725 kilograms, powered by a 1,131 cubic centimeters air-cooled engine producing 25 horsepower. Its rear-wheel drive system was unconventional, yet it performed remarkably well off-road. The Schwimmwagen, its amphibious counterpart, boasted a selectable four-wheel drive and a small propeller for water travel. In an ironic twist, these vehicles, built under Nazi Germany's wartime constraints, showcased ingenious engineering with minimal resources, often outperforming heavier Allied vehicles in soft terrain and muddy fields. By May 1945, roughly 18,000 Kübelwagens and 3,200 Schwimmwagens survived in various conditions. American forces found the largest concentrations in southern Germany around Munich and Stuttgart, where Wehrmacht logistics units had attempted last-minute defensive preparations. The Wolfsburg factory, soon to be renamed under British control, still held 312 incomplete vehicles on the line, along with tools and dies for thousands of additional parts. In the east, Soviet forces discovered fewer complete vehicles but abundant spare parts at factories in Saxony and Thuringia. In northern Germany, British forces located around 4,800 serviceable jeeps, many abandoned by units surrendering intact. The Allies were immediately faced with logistical and moral challenges. Unlike tanks that required cranes or rail transport, these jeeps could simply be driven away. Military police struggled to inventory vehicles that disappeared into civilian hands, taken by opportunistic locals or repurposed by occupation troops themselves. These humble vehicles, so often overlooked in the chaos of war, now became the center of debates among American, British, and Soviet authorities. The Americans approached them scientifically. The Enemy Equipment Intelligence Service, headquartered near Frankfurt, began transporting captured Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens to specialized proving grounds. By November 1945, 12 Kübelwagens had reached the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, while 8 Schwimmwagens were sent to the Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi, to test their amphibious capabilities. Engineers documented production methods, noting that Volkswagen had built military vehicles with roughly 30% fewer man-hours than equivalent American models. The results were impressive. At Aberdeen, Kübelwagens proved capable of navigating soft terrain that bogged down heavier Allied jeeps. Ground pressure measurements showed that their lightweight design and tire configuration allowed them to traverse muddy fields and snow with remarkable ease. Schwimmwagens impressed evaluators with water speeds of 10 km per hour, faster than any American amphibious vehicle of comparable size. Yet engineers also noted vulnerabilities. The air-cooled engine could seize in extreme cold, and wartime material substitutions compromised durability. British authorities, constrained by resources, took a different approach. While American forces conducted extensive tests, the British immediately repurposed vehicles for occupation duties. They painted them in olive drab, deployed them across their zones, and noted their exceptional fuel efficiency, achieving 13 km per liter compared to the Jeep's 8 km per liter. In contrast, the Soviets were less interested in individual units and more focused on industrial capture. Trophy brigades dismantled factories, shipping presses, dyes, and production equipment back to the USSR, leaving only remnants for post-war use. Amidst all this, Allied officers began to realize that these vehicles were more than military hardware. They were industrial treasures, representing German efficiency and ingenuity at its peak. Major Ivan Heist, a British officer embedded with American forces, submitted reports emphasizing that the design principles could be adapted for civilian purposes. The Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen were war machines with a hidden post-war legacy, and their fate would depend on how the Allies chose to balance security, utility, and reconstruction. While the Germans had abandoned their military jeeps across the landscape, the Allies were actively shaping their post-war destiny. In the United States, captured Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens were treated as objects of scientific inquiry. Engineers meticulously measured suspension travel, recorded fuel efficiency, and disassembled engines to understand their construction. They studied production methods at Volkswagen, noting the precision stamping, efficient assembly line, and minimal use of scarce materials, all innovations that could inform post-war American manufacturing. At Aberdeen, tests revealed the Kübelwagen's unexpected off-road agility. Despite its lack of four-wheel drive, it navigated deep mud, soft snow, and uneven terrain with ease. The Schwimmwagen, on the other hand, displayed amphibious capabilities that surprised many observers. Its propeller and watertight design allowed for rapid river crossings, an engineering feat that highlighted German ingenuity under wartime constraints. But Americans also recognized the weaknesses: engines prone to freezing in winter, pressed steel replacing more durable components, and synthetic materials of uncertain longevity. Meanwhile, in the British occupation zone, pragmatism ruled. Officers quickly realized that the jeeps could fill critical gaps in a war-torn landscape. Fuel was scarce, roads were damaged, and transportation for officials, police, and reconstruction crews was desperately needed. By May 1945, British forces had commandeered thousands of Kübelwagens from Wehrmacht stockpiles. Vehicles were painted in olive drab, fitted with British markings, and pressed into immediate service. Their fuel efficiency and low maintenance needs made them indispensable in rebuilding efforts. At the same time, British officers faced a delicate decision. The Volkswagen factory itself could either be dismantled, fulfilling the Allied mandate to eliminate Germany's war potential, or preserved as a tool for economic recovery. Major Ivan Heist championed preservation, arguing that civilian production would help rebuild Germany while keeping the factory under Allied supervision. By late 1945, this vision began to take shape. Between September 1945 and December 1946, the factory resumed limited production, delivering over 1,700 Type 82 vehicles to British forces. These vehicles were nearly identical to their wartime counterparts but painted in civilian tones. The Soviets approached the Kübelwagen dilemma differently. Their priorities were industrial, not practical. Trophy brigades systematically dismantled German factories, shipping presses, dyes, and component manufacturing equipment to Soviet plants. Between 1945 and 1947, Soviet engineers transported roughly 160 Kübelwagens and 45 Schwimmwagens to the USSR. They studied chassis design, engine configuration, and production methods with secrecy, attempting to glean insights for potential domestic vehicles. However, Soviet forces were not interested in operational use. Individual vehicles were secondary to the broader industrial knowledge they represented. This created a striking contrast. Americans prioritized technical analysis, British officers prioritized immediate utility and reconstruction, and the Soviets prioritized industrial capture. These differing approaches would shape the post-war legacy of Germany's military jeeps in profound ways. By late 1945, the Allies also confronted another dilemma: the jeep's ambiguous status. Though lightly armed and unarmored, they were clearly designed for military use. Allied Control Council laws demanded the elimination of Germany's war potential. Yet these vehicles were highly practical for civilian reconstruction. Decisions varied widely. American authorities often destroyed surplus vehicles through target practice or crushing, while the British opted for resale to municipalities, public utilities, and local farmers. The French occupation zone, meanwhile, enforced a strict destruction policy, prioritizing demilitarization over utility. The fate of these vehicles became a race against time. In the American zone, approximately 1,800 Kübelwagens were gathered at training grounds and methodically destroyed between April and July 1946. Bulldozers crushed them, and artillery units used them for live-fire exercises. The scrap steel was repurposed to fuel Europe's desperate reconstruction. British pragmatism allowed thousands more to survive. Vehicles were sold to German municipalities and private buyers, often converted into delivery vans, agricultural vehicles, or civilian trucks. Meanwhile, the Schwimmwagen suffered the most severe losses, with nearly 85% destroyed by 1950, as its amphibious design left little opportunity for civilian adaptation. By 1947, the surviving Kübelwagens were already beginning to assume a new role, a bridge between war and peace. They became training vehicles, border patrol transports, and the earliest civilian conversions of post-war Germany. In the United States, military bases retained a small number for evaluation, while some were quietly sold as surplus. Museums began acquiring them as historical artifacts, preserving rare examples for posterity. The differences in Allied priorities shaped the vehicle's survival and influenced Europe's industrial recovery. American engineering rigor ensured detailed documentation and technical knowledge transfer. British pragmatism facilitated immediate utility and civilian adaptation. Soviet industrial capture enriched domestic manufacturing, but left little for historical preservation. Together, these approaches determined which Jeeps survived, which were lost forever, and which became symbols of post-war reconstruction. As 1946 began, the pace of destruction accelerated. Allied forces, operating under the mandate to eliminate Germany's military potential, had to make hard decisions about what constituted a threat. The Kübelwagen, deceptively small and unarmed, sat at the center of these debates. In the American zone, destruction was thorough. Military planners gathered vehicles in training areas such as Grafenwohr and Hohenfels. Bulldozers crushed them, artillery units tore them apart, and the scrap steel fed reconstruction efforts. By late 1947, thousands of Kübelwagens had been erased from the European landscape. Schwimmwagens were targeted even more aggressively. Their amphibious design left no room for civilian adaptation, ensuring that the vast majority, over 85%, were destroyed within 5 years of Germany's surrender. British forces, operating with limited resources, adopted a more practical approach. Vehicles in working condition were sold to approved German buyers. Municipal authorities, public utilities, and farmers eagerly purchased them. These Jeeps were transformed, stripped of military markings, and converted into delivery trucks, farm vehicles, and light commercial transport. Their low weight, fuel efficiency, and reliability made them indispensable in a country struggling to rebuild roads, bridges, and cities. Meanwhile, the Soviets prioritized industrial capture. Factories producing Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens were dismantled and shipped to the USSR. Presses, dyes, and assembly machinery became part of Soviet automotive plants. Individual vehicles were transported in limited numbers, primarily for reverse engineering. The Soviets were less concerned with operational use than with understanding production techniques. Survival often depended on luck, geography, and bureaucratic decisions. Vehicles located in British zones, sold to civilians, or overlooked by Soviet trophy brigades became rare survivors. Some were retained for training and evaluation. Museums, recognizing historical significance early, began acquiring examples as early as 1947. By the 1950s, only a small fraction of wartime production remained. The transformation of surviving vehicles was dramatic. Kübelwagens converted to civilian use were often fitted with pickup beds, modified suspension, or reinforced cargo areas. They became postal delivery vans, agricultural transport, or commercial work vehicles. Schwimmwagens, with their amphibious abilities, were rarely adapted for civilian purposes, making them even rarer. By the late 1940s, the number of surviving vehicles had dwindled drastically. American forces maintained a handful for evaluation. British forces continued to use converted Jeeps for occupation duties, and Soviets retained some for reverse engineering. The fate of these vehicles reflected not only Allied policy, but also the broader trajectory of post-war Europe. The surviving vehicles would go on to influence post-war industrial design indirectly. American automotive manufacturers studied Volkswagen's production efficiency, incorporating lessons in simplified assembly and part standardization into civilian vehicle production. While the military implications were minimal, the legacy of these vehicles lived on in manufacturing philosophy, demonstrating how wartime innovation could inform peacetime industry. By the mid-1950s, the post-war landscape had transformed. The majority of wartime Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens had vanished, destroyed by Allied mandates, converted for civilian use, or lost to time. Fewer than 200 Kübelwagens and barely 160 Schwimmwagens survive today worldwide. Those that remain are treasured artifacts, preserved in museums, private collections, and a few rare operational examples. Museums such as the Deutsches Museum in Munich, the Imperial War Museum in London, and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington hold some of the earliest preserved vehicles. Restoration efforts intensified from the 1980s onward, with enthusiasts recovering vehicles from lakes, forests, and abandoned training grounds. Some Schwimmwagens were recovered from Norwegian lakes in 1984. Kübelwagens surfaced in Polish forests in 1997. Their rarity has made them highly valuable, often fetching tens of thousands of dollars at auctions. The story of these vehicles illustrates a broader historical lesson. They were built for war but survived because of peace, industrial curiosity, and bureaucratic decisions. Their destruction, survival, and transformation demonstrate how victory, occupation, and post-war planning interact to shape historical artifacts. Today, visitors to military museums can see the Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen as reminders of ingenuity under constraints, the complexity of Allied occupation policies, and the thin line between military necessity and civilian utility. The vehicle's lightweight construction, clever engineering, and fuel efficiency continue to impress historians, engineers, and enthusiasts alike. The Volkswagen factory, preserved through British pragmatism, became a cornerstone of post-war economic recovery. Civilian production resumed, eventually giving rise to the Volkswagen Beetle, one of the most iconic cars in automotive history. The Kübelwagen's philosophy of simplicity and efficiency lived on, influencing both civilian and military vehicle design for decades. In the end, the Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen serve as silent witnesses to history, small, unarmed machines that survived bombs, occupation, bureaucratic mandates, and the deliberate erasure of war. They reveal the choices and priorities of the victors, and how even the humblest machines can leave a lasting legacy when war ends and peace begins. Within 5 years of the war's end, nearly 80% of these vehicles were gone. What remained did so by chance, careful policy, or civilian adaptation. Today, fewer than 400 vehicles survive globally, making them rarer than even some of the most feared tanks of the war. The Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen remind us that survival is not always about strength. It can be about timing, perception, and how the world chooses to remember or erase history.